and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay and today's video is going to be a solved true crime case from France again, and this one has taken quite a few weeks of research. That's why I'm posting so late. It will actually be a two-parter just because of how long the video is going to be. Yeah, it's one of the biggest cases, one of the most controversial cases. It's regarded as a judicial fiasco in France. And I don't think there's really any information about this in English, so I just wanted to share it with you guys just because, yeah, it's a huge case. I will say it is very dark, very heartbreaking. There are mentions of child abuse, physical abuse, sexual assault and rape, pedophilia, child prostitution, and overall a huge sense of injustice. So if these are topics you would rather stay away from, I would highly recommend clicking out of this video and the next one. And I cannot emphasize enough just how heartbreaking this case is. It is very difficult to talk about. It was hard to research. I will be taking a little break from true crime after these two videos are out, but I do think it's important to share these stories. So that's what I've done. I will do my best to not give my personal opinion throughout this video. I will do everything I can. Just because, first of all, I don't want to get in trouble, but also it is a very polarizing case still in France, even though this happened in 2000, early 2000s. People still have very strong opinions about this case. And also I want to do my best to give you all of the information so that you can draw your own conclusions should you have any opinions about it. I'm here to just give you the facts. Hopefully I do this case justice, and if anybody watching is very familiar with this case and I've said anything incorrect, or if I've said anything that's wrong, please comment down below. I did spend quite a lot of time researching this, so yeah, this is gonna be long, so let me just hop into this just before I start talking about this case. If you do enjoy true crime videos, sometimes hamster content, it's been a long time since I've posted anything related to arts and crafts, but anyway, I would love to have you join my channel or even like this video. If not, that's absolutely fine. But it does make me very happy to see new people subscribing every day, so welcome, and let's just get this case started. The main protagonist in this entire case is Myriam Badaoui. She has a troubled past. She was raised in Algeria, and at the age of 3, her parents divorced due to her mother's infidelity, and her father managed to get custody of Miriam. She would often get beat up by her dad for asking questions about her mom, and when she turned 7, her father started grooming her. By the time she was 8, he was sexually assaulting her, and by the time she turned 10, he kind of got sick of her or felt like she was a burden, so he sold her to her uncle, where she would basically be used as a cleaning maid. And later on, she would be asked to marry her own cousin, and at first she's actually quite happy to do so because for an entire week, he did not ask anything. He didn't ask for anything sexual out of her, which is horrendous. She unfortunately thought this might finally be love. Obviously, she grew up without any form of love from her family, but not long after, he also started raping her. She managed to leave him later on, and in 1990, she divorced her latest partner to move to France. She had 2 kids with this man, a daughter and then a son, and she made the decision, I'm not sure why, to leave her firstborn daughter with her ex-husband in Algeria, and she moved to Outreau in the north of France with her 1-year-old son, Shérif. There she met Thierry, who is also the main protagonist in this case, and he also was separated. He had 2 daughters of his own, and they ended up getting married. Miriam and Thierry got married, and he ended up adopting her son, Shérif. So the son she brought with her from Algeria, but because he was very racist and wasn't too interested in keeping that, he didn't like the fact that he had an Algerian background. He didn't really care for Shérif's name. It reminded him of his Algerian roots, so he had his name changed to Kevin, which is insane. Like, how could you possibly let your new husband change your son's name to Kevin just to erase his roots? That's absolutely wild to me. And for information, in this case, I will be referring to Kevin as Shérif because that is his name. He doesn't go by Kevin. He only got the name Kevin because of Thierry Delay, but I will be referring to him as Sherif. Because of Miriam's background, unfortunately, she tried her best to be the perfect wife for Thierry Delay. She wanted to do everything he wanted her to do. Basically, she just wanted to please him, she wanted to feel loved, and she wanted to feel like she was being a good wife. They ended up having their own first child together in 1992, Dimitri, and then in 1994 they had Jonathan, followed by Dylan in 1996. Neither of them liked to work, and neither of them really did work, though to be fair, I suppose one of them had to stay home to look after 4 children, which they also didn't do. At least they didn't take care of their kids the way they should have. Thierry himself was a severe alcoholic. He would often beat Miriam, and he was well known in the residential area to be a very angry person. He would have serious outbursts of anger. They lived in this building called La Tour du Renard, which literally translates to the Fox's Tower. And it's just, again, it's like a, I don't know what to call these compounds of like different buildings together, kind of like a city, like a cité. Anyway, a group of buildings all linked together, and they lived in one specific building. All the neighbors kind of knew each other. He was infamous for being incredibly angry and, again, very alcoholic. No one was crazy enough to confront him directly about his attitude because, again, he was very violent. He scared everyone, kind of ran the place. But a lot of neighbors were questioning the parenting techniques of this couple because they would often see the kids running up and down the stairs fully naked, which is a huge red flag. And it did prompt some of the neighbors to contact social services just to make them aware of the situation. Now, social services had been aware of this family for a while now. They were keeping a close eye on them, mostly since 1995, and they were very aware of the frequent trips the kids would have to make to the hospital due to accidents they were in. They needed surgeries, and all of the hospital visits were obvious signs of abuse, like as a result of abuse. So they were very aware of what was going on. I'm not quite sure why they didn't immediately do something, though I do understand that there's this feeling that they'll do everything they can to keep the kids with their family because it's better than putting them in foster care. Is that correct? I'm not sure. I did hear that. Either way, they already suspected Miriam was like a manipulator and like a liar. She was very good at manipulating and lying. She would always give reasons or excuses for her kids being constantly in and out of the hospital. Eventually, a kindergarten teacher who was looking after one of the kids was checking up on him and noticed blood coming out of his anus, which was incredibly alarming, incredibly concerning, and the school contacted social services to let them know. They contacted them multiple times, so the school did do their job. They reported everything they saw that was wrong, and eventually Sherif, the eldest, asked to be put in a foster home, and I believe he maybe was old enough to be placed there because he ended up going to a foster home, and every other weekend he would come home. So he'd be in a foster home for like 2 weeks and then go home for a weekend and then another 2 weeks and then go home for the weekend. So he did manage to be placed in a foster home first, but I'm not sure why the other ones weren't. Unfortunately, it's when he got placed in a foster home that the abuse started. When Sherif was around 8 years old, his father gave him a gift for Christmas, and Sherif was actually really excited. Obviously, it's Christmas Day, your parents just gave you a gift, and they were VHS tapes. Obviously, this was in the 90s, so VHS tapes were like the DVD of the time. And he was so excited. He got some VHS tapes for Christmas. He thought it was a cartoon. He assumed it was maybe a movie. He like, oh my God, Dad, can we please watch it now? He was just really excited to watch this tape. And when his dad put it on, you know, basically saying, oh, well, if you insist, we'll just watch it together, put the tape on, and quickly Sherif realized that he didn't really like the movie. He didn't really get it. It happened to be a porn tape. So his father had gifted his 8-year-old son a porn tape. He was young enough to not understand fully what was going on the tape, but old enough to know that it didn't feel right. He didn't like it, and he asked his dad to turn it off. He said, look, I don't really like this. I don't really like this gift, to be honest. And his dad said, what do you mean you don't like my Christmas gift? Yes, you do. And then played the second tape, and he basically forced Sherif to watch it. Sherif tried to walk away because he really didn't want to keep watching this tape. He didn't like it. And once he started walking away, his father started beating him and attached him to a chair to force him to keep watching the tape. Again, Sherif did everything he could to stop watching it. He would try closing his eyes, and that just upset his father even more. Although I should say stepfather, that just upset Thierry even more, and that's when he started sexually assaulting him. He had locked himself in the room with Sherif, and Miriam was on the other side, basically shouting at them, asking for him to stop. This was just the beginning of an incredibly long string of sexual assaults. This happened while he was still spending the week in foster care, and unfortunately Sherif would just spend his time in foster care knowing that every other weekend he would come back to this nightmare of his father sexually assaulting him. He did keep telling foster care that he did not want to go home, he didn't want to go back. He never really specified why. Obviously he was briefed by his father to not say what was going on at home, but he was insistent. He did not want to come home. And of course, just because a child says they don't want to come home, that's not enough. If they don't give a reason, then, you know, well, you're still going to have to come home. Those are your parents, and that's the agreement, unfortunately. He lived through almost 2 years of this nightmare, and he did say in a later interview he used to pray to God to help him and to make it stop, which is horrendous. It's just so sad. And he was very concerned for his younger siblings as well. He knew he wasn't the only one who was going to be affected by Thierry Delay, so he did try to have them placed in a foster home as well, just to keep them safe from the parents. But again, he was really young. That's a huge responsibility. You shouldn't ever go through that, let alone worry about your younger siblings being abused by your stepfather or your mother. By 1997, Myriam Badaoui was reported as psychologically incapable of taking care of her own children. However, she did everything she could to keep them and to not have her kids placed in foster homes, because obviously they both got money for taking care of their kids, for looking after their kids. They didn't work, so they got government money to look after their kids, and if the kids were placed in a foster home, they would no longer have that money, and they didn't work. So in order to not lose the financial support or benefits, she did everything she could to keep the kids at home, which makes me so angry because Thierry Delay was very well known to be a violent person, let alone a violent father and a violent husband. He often abused Miriam, and she would rile the boys up because she knew that if something was wrong, went wrong, if any of them did something wrong, the father would retaliate. And if he didn't retaliate against the children, he would retaliate against her. And instead of defending her children, she would sometimes just save herself and let them take the heat. So she would kind of rile them up to have the blame put on them, which is incredibly fucked up. And obviously none of the kids had any normal family memories with their parents. They never got to know what it was like growing up in a loving family. All they knew was pain and abuse. And according to the children, Thierry Delay was a fan of horror movies. He would often wear a scream mask and wake them up in the middle of the night, chase them around the house before sexually assaulting them, which is hands down one of the worst things I've ever heard in my entire life. And the mother would often participate by holding the boys down or basically preventing them from kicking or running away or defending themselves. So she was just as involved. She wasn't really trying to stop this. She was pretty much helping her husband do what he wanted to do. Now, as I've said before, social services were aware of this family. They kept an eye on them. They knew this was a really troubled home. The children had been briefed, as I've said, by Thierry Delay to basically act normal outside of the house. And to the point where he would threaten to kill them if they said anything. And that's when some of the children were old enough to understand that if your dad's threatening to kill you for saying what's going on at home, then maybe what's going on at home isn't normal. Obviously, as a child, you're never going to assume that your parents want to hurt you or want to harm you. So I think some of them were starting to wake up to the abuse and realize, like, this isn't normal, this isn't what happens in other families. According to the kids, Miriam did apologize quite a lot. She kept telling her kids she was sorry. I do understand she has a very troubled past, and she was also a victim in this relationship, but she was also an active participant in the abuse against her children. So it is difficult to make excuses for her. It's really hard to make excuses for her, mostly because in 1998, one of the social workers noticed that one of the kids was acting very odd at school. He would basically imitate sexual gestures that a child that age shouldn't be aware of. And it actually made the teachers think that maybe the child had been sexually assaulted himself. Obviously, because how else would he know about this? And this did get looked into. Social services confronted Miriam about this. Police actually spoke to Miriam about this. That's how serious it got, obviously. And she basically confessed that her son had been sexually assaulted during the summer of 1997, but they never knew who had done it, so they just moved on and never looked into it. So basically, she confessed to police that her son had been sexually assaulted by a stranger, but they didn't know who it was, so they never reported it, and that's why the kid's acting strange at school, which is... just lock her up right now. Like, the whole family. Like, the whole, like, just both parents. That's what I mean, not the kids. It's only in the year 2000 that Myriam Badaoui finally asked social services to have her sons placed in foster homes because she could no longer handle them, but mostly because Thierry had finally done something that made her snap out of it. Thierry had asked Miriam and Dylan, the youngest, to go and get him some beers in the shop, so they left the house to get some beers, while Jonathan was playing video games in the living room. And out of nowhere, Thierry got extremely angry, just had an outburst of anger, smashed the console Jonathan was playing with, threw it out the window before picking Jonathan up and hanging him over the balcony. Like, he just lifted him over the balcony railing, so just basically like... the only thing I can think of is like that picture of Michael Jackson holding his kid. And this was like 5 floors up. So he basically held Jonathan over the balcony into the open and hung him onto the balcony. Basically, I'm not using the right words, but Jonathan had to hold on to the railing with his own arms. And bear in mind, he was 6 years old and they were living on the 5th floor. So Thierry just let his kid hang there from the balcony and just went back inside to drink. By then, Miriam was leaving the building, and when she looked up and saw Jonathan hanging there, clinging for dear life, she ran upstairs to rescue him, bring him back inside, and that's when she finally realized her kids needed to be out of this house. The 3 remaining kids, so Jonathan, Dimitri, and Dylan, were sent to separate foster homes. Sharif was already in a foster home himself, and none of them got to stay together, unfortunately, so they were all separated into different homes, but at least they were no longer with Thierry and Miriam, who were the worst parents ever. On November 30th, 2000, 2 of the foster families contacted social services regarding the boys that were in the care. Now, the families did not know each other. They didn't know that the kids they were looking after were related, but the 2 children in question were Dimitri and Jonathan Delay. It's unclear which one of them spoke first. Allegedly, Jonathan was the first one to accidentally share what was going on at home, because when he was placed in a foster home, he was looking around in the living room, he saw a bunch of tapes, and then he asked his foster mom if she had any porn tapes, which again is not a question you ever expect. I believe he was still 6 at the time that year, a 6-year-old to ask, and that was the first red flag. She immediately contacted social services. Meanwhile, Dimitri confessed to his foster parents that his dad would often make love to him, which again, that's more than a red flag. You know, they contacted social services immediately, and all of the children individually started talking. Now, I do want to emphasize that they had no way of talking to each other. This was like 2000. They had no phones, no texting. One of them was 4, the other one was 6, 8, and 10. They were very young. They had no way to conspire and like come up with these lies. And they didn't know the other children were talking. They just started telling their foster families what was going on because, of course, they contacted social services, who then started speaking to the children. The 4 kids' stories all lined up. They basically confirmed that they were all being sexually assaulted, mostly by their father or stepfather, Thierry Delay, and Sharif Delay, who was 10 years old at the time. He was the eldest, confirmed everything that the other 3 brothers were saying. their parents were sexually abusive. Thankfully, social services took everything incredibly seriously. It was upsetting to know that it took that long for them to have them placed in foster homes, let alone to have the parents looked into, but they did take everything very seriously. I think the reason they took it so seriously is because they could tell that the kids had no way of like speaking to each other beforehand. They all kind of started talking, all of the stories lined up, and it was incredibly concerning. Police obviously quickly got involved. In January 2001, all of the children were interviewed multiple times. Most of the time, the interviews were taped. However, years later, we would find out that none of the tapes could be found, which is very suspicious, but allegedly all of the interviews were taped, and now they no longer have the tapes. But they told police that their parents were sexually abusive. Obviously, they used their own words, their children. They used their own words to describe what was going on at home, but they told police that there was usually a lot of alcohol involved, that there was a bowl, like a box of condoms available for whoever wanted to start having sex with the children. And they actually started saying that Thierry would always have a porn tape playing in the background, like 24/7, day and night. There would always be a porn tape playing on TV, which a lot of neighbors were aware of, I guess, which is just messed up. The children all get medical attention and they get examined, and unfortunately they found very solid evidence of repeated assault and rape. And when looking into their medical history, police found out that the children had suffered from STDs, anal hemorrhage, infections, chronic diarrhea, basically things that no child should ever experience, and all of them were obvious signs of sexual abuse, let alone physical abuse. One of them got hospitalized 9 times in a period of 3 years, while the other one was hospitalized 11 times. What the Delay children were confessing to police was absolutely horrendous. To be honest, they were absolutely not prepared to hear these stories. They were describing scenes of torture. They would say that the adults would use anything from toys to forks to assault them. And like, despite all of the medical evidence to back up the sexual assault and abuse, police still asked the kids if they weren't exaggerating. They wanted to make sure that the kids were telling the truth, because they just couldn't believe what the kids were saying, to be honest, and I think they just somehow didn't really want to fully believe that this was the truth. So they did double check with the children, saying, are you sure you're not just angry at your parents and you're trying to retaliate by saying these horrible things? But when you think about it, children that age shouldn't even be aware of like 10% of what they're saying to police. Like, I know at that age I had no idea what any of this was. And yeah, they just wanted to be sure, because if that was the truth, then that was like, how could you wrap your head around the fact that this has happened to 4 children? Like, you almost don't want to believe it. However, to make things worse, they actually started implicating other adults and other children. So all 4 children started saying, well, actually, it wasn't just our parents, there were more adults involved, and there were more victims. There were other children who were going through what we were going through. And police did not expect more people to be involved. That's the last thing they wanted to hear. They already had a hard time listening to the children's testimonies, and now they're finding out that there's more. And the children were saying a lot of these assaults were filmed on tape, and that there were quite a lot of women involved as well, which is why it got so much attention at the time. And that's what piqued, I mean, it's the wrong phrasing, but like, police were very, very intrigued, because you don't often hear about women in cases of sexual assault against children. It's mostly men that you hear of. It's very unusual, and if there are women, there aren't that many, but this was almost 50-50, which was, again, highly, highly unusual. Sherif, the eldest, named 7 men and women who have sexually assaulted him. Myriam, Badaoui, and Thierry were immediately questioned, and Thierry denied any involvement. He stuck to that story for ages. He basically just said, I have nothing to do with this, these are lies. But Miriam claims that she has done nothing wrong, but she also didn't straight out say her children were lying. She was basically just trying to remove herself from the situation, but she wasn't saying that what the children were saying was wrong. After telling police about her past, I think she was hoping to give them a little bit of context. to make her look better or maybe less guilty, she finally admitted to the judge that she did rape and sexually assault her own children. Of course, the couple was immediately put into custody, and Myriam wrote to the judge, Fabrice Burgot, the judge who was in charge of this entire affair, and she confirmed that her kids were telling the truth and that she deserved whatever came her way because she knew her children would never recover from what they had done to them. Unfortunately, Thierry Delay was not arrested at his home. He was initially brought in for questioning first, so that could have given him time to eliminate any evidence or prepare his answers. And when police finally searched their apartment, they found 163 porn tapes, 12 sex toys, and a pair of handcuffs. Now, there was no actual evidence that any of this was used against the children. However, there was a tape in that collection of tapes where Miriam and Thierry Delay are filmed having sex, and you can see one of the kids in the video watching. So that was just bad enough. That's as much evidence they could get physically in terms of tapes and children being involved in the sexual acts. Now, the 4 boys on their side involved up to 50 kids and 40 adults, which is mind-boggling. Obviously, police are shitting themselves. And Miriam admitted that Thierry often assaulted their children and that she also participated. So she's involving him from the get-go, even though he is denying any involvement. She actually does a lot better than that. She told police that their next-door neighbors, 21-year-old Aurélie Grenon and 27-year-old David Delplanque, would often come over and participate. She herself implicated 10 adults who lived in the same building or town, and police couldn't believe it. There's more? Where does this end, and how big is this case just gonna be? This was no longer a messed up family and incest and sexual assault within that family. This was basically a network of child abusers, and allegedly, from what the children were saying, word got around town that Thierry would do that to his own kids, and a lot of children would end up being swapped and traded in exchange for money. I must say, all things considered, police did do everything right. You hear about a lot of cases where police don't do what they should have done, but they basically did a mass arrest of all of the names that were on the list. They arrested dozens of children. Well, they weren't arresting the children, but they brought in dozens of children and 40 to 50 adults at once in the police station for interrogation. And basically their goal was to interrogate all of these people separately at once so that they couldn't know what was coming and they had no time to speak to each other to make sure their answers matched. Basically, they wanted to make sure that they had time to interrogate everyone at once simultaneously to make sure they had the right story and that none of it was tarnished by someone else's version, basically. What's insane is that some of the adults confessed to certain crimes, while others insisted they had nothing to do with any of it. The adults that did confess to certain acts were also brought up by some of the children, and this children's version of events lined up with what the adults were saying. Some of the adults were implicating other adults, and the whole, the stories matched, so police are okay, so this is actually happening, this is real. And after hearing some of the stories, police are quite convinced that the couple next door is definitely involved. So Aurélie Grenon and David Delplanque, they brought those in for interrogation. They initially denied everything, but they eventually confessed. Aurélie and David explained to police that they had been hanging out at the Delay household, in their apartment. And as usual, there was a porn tape going on in the background. This was apparently a thing. And that's when Thierry just basically casually brought up, would you want to have sex with the two of us? So basically, I guess a swinger type of event. Basically both couples would have sex, all 4 of them together, like an orgy. And they thought he was joking. Good one. But then they realized he wasn't joking. So the next day they did come over in order to have sex with Miriam and Thierry. And that they explained to police that the second they started having sex, Thierry brought in the kids. The kids kind of just showed up in the room as if they knew what was going to happen next. And they were very taken aback by this. They're like, what's going on? And he started having sex with one of his kids and they didn't like it. Allegedly, Aurélie and David were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't want to be looking at this. This isn't right. But then Miriam tried to convince them, say, look, you know, you have never tried this. You should give it a try. It's actually really nice. Basically convinced them to let the kids be involved in this orgy, and they did. Like, they just let it happen. Like that's any sort of excuse. But they did insist that it only happened once and it was just the four of them and no one else was involved. However, they also did tell police that they sexually assaulted their own children. So that's just something else. So on top of having sex with Myriam and Thierry Delay's children, they only once allegedly, you know, and we found it gross, they then in the same interrogation confessed to having sexually assaulted their own kids. So I don't know how you could find it that gross that you would do it again. But anyway, so they were definitely implicated. They both confessed, and over time Aurélie Grenon started giving names just like Myriam Badaoui. Amongst the people who had been brought in for mass questioning, Monique Fougrol had been told by police, according to Myriam Badaoui, every single one of her children had been sexually assaulted by Thierry Delay and Miriam, which was news to her because her children had literally never set foot in that apartment. They would sometimes grab groceries for them, but they would always leave them on the front door, like on the welcome mat, and then leave. They'd never been inside the flat. So she's like, all right, well, you're gonna have to tell me how, because they've never spent any amount of time with them. And another person that was mentioned by the children this time was Jean-Marc Couvillard. Now, he lived about 300 meters away from that building. He was basically in that neighborhood. And when police showed up at his house to bring him in for questioning, his mother answered the door and she had no idea what was going on. All she knew was that police was looking to get him in for questioning. So she basically told them, like, right, give me a second, I'm gonna help him get dressed. And they're like, what do you mean? What do you mean you're gonna help him get dressed? Like, isn't he like 43? And she's like, yeah, he needs help getting dressed because he was intellectually disabled. So he could pretty much eat on his own. That's the extent of his independence. She had to do everything else for him. She would help him shower, cut his food, go to the bathroom, get dressed. Since the day he was born, she always did that for him because he was incapable of doing any of that on his own. And of course, police were taken aback because they're like, well, hold on, how could he have sexually assaulted children if he can't even dress himself? But they still brought him in. And the children had accused him of having used sex toys on them and inserting random objects, which again puzzled police a little bit. Another person who had been arrested was another neighbor in that building, Thierry, and he had been accused of chasing the kids alongside Jean-Marc Couvillard, the one who was disabled, and scaring them, basically chasing the kids around, scaring them, and he denied doing any of that. And again, police were very suspicious of Jean-Marc being involved in any capacity just because of his disability. They didn't believe Thierry, so they put him in custody, like they actually arrested him, but for Jean-Marc Couvillard, he was deemed criminally irresponsible due to the fact that he was incapable of assaulting the children. And it's absolutely insane that he wasn't declared innocent or acquitted or anything like that. He, instead of being let go and say, right, you clearly have nothing to do with this case, if you're gonna go with, you know, the fact that he's intellectually disabled and couldn't have attacked anyone, then why is he deemed criminally irresponsible? Like, that still implies him. It's very, very frustrating that he didn't, I don't know. Anyway, to be fair, I think police genuinely were in over their heads. Sandrine and Franck Lavier, a couple who lived downstairs, they were like the downstairs neighbor. I think they lived on the 4th floor. They were also arrested. Myriam Badaoui had accused Frank of beating his own daughter, which is an important nugget of information for later. So please remember the name Franck Lavier. But the police spoke to the children and the children said, no, they never did any of that. Our parents didn't beat us up or anything. So basically they let the couple go home because the children didn't implicate them. A lot of what the Delay children, all 4 boys, told the police was confirmed by Myriam Badaoui's confession. So she ended up writing to the judge actually quite frequently. She wrote to him quite a lot. And she continued to defend her children and said they're not lying. She also took time to accuse Thierry Delay as like the main instigator, like the guy who's in charge for all of this, the guy who's responsible for this entire fucked up scenario. He was like the head honcho of this operation. Police interviewed the kids individually multiple times. All of their stories did line up amongst themselves, and none of them faltered. None of the stories changed. This clearly wasn't rehearsed or memorized. They never gave an incorrect version of events, even though they were being interviewed multiple times, which is important to note. And it's crazy that a lot of the adults were implicating others. Their stories did match up with the children's stories. The thing is, because these were very, very serious allegations, the children of the adults mentioned in the interrogations were immediately placed in foster care while police tried to find out more about what truly happened, which sounds extreme, but at the same time, it's a difficult one. You hear about these insane allegations against children that their own parents are sexually assaulting them. Like, what's the right move? Do you let them stay with their parents until you're trying to figure out if that's happening or not, or do you put them in foster care and keep them safe while you're trying to sort this whole thing out? It's a complicated one. So in this case, that's what they did. They placed them all in foster care. 20 children were taken out of their parents' care, like taken out of their families. But the thing is, now that the children were being placed away from their families, they started talking, and some people believe that they started talking because they thought that confessing to certain things would let them go back home with their parents. But then some people say no, they finally started sharing their stories because they were finally in a safe place and they didn't have to worry about their parents anymore, so they could tell the truth. Unfortunately, a lot of what the children were saying in those confessions lined up with what the Delay children were saying. And again, there was absolutely no way for any of them to communicate amongst each other. Like, that would require an amount of work for like kids under the age of 10. I mean, so the stories did line up. In her many letters to the judge, Miriam begged him to set her free and let her leave jail. She didn't understand why she couldn't go home, because she's like, well, I told you everything I know, so just let me go home, which is not how it works. Absolutely not. However, in her defense, she saw that Aurélie Grenon, the next door neighbor who had confessed to having sexually assaulted the Delay children on top of her own with her partner, she got to go home. She wasn't in custody. She literally got sent home, which is wild. Like, it's absolutely bananas that she got sent home after confessing to having sexually assaulted multiple children. And obviously Miriam saw that and she's like, whoa, like, I've confessed to like way worse. Why am I not in my own living room right now? And she was being very upset. So she basically kept writing to the judge saying like, well, what do I need to do? Do I need to tell you more? Like, I have nothing else to confess to. Like, do I need to lie to get out of prison? Basically, she was implying that the judge was telling her that if she kept talking, she would go home, which again, there's absolutely no evidence of that. I highly doubt the judge was like, keep dropping names and then you get to go home. She was never gonna go home. But in her letters to the judge, that's what she makes it sound like. She basically says, you told me that if I kept talking, I would go home, and I'm still not home. What's going on? Out of all of the adults who have been arrested, only 3 confessed to having sexually assaulted the children. Myriam Badaoui, Aurélie Grenon, and David Delplanque. Thierry Delay was still denying everything alongside every other adult who had been arrested or interrogated. On May 2nd, 2001, Miriam finally got to speak to the judge in person. He brought her into his office. She spoke to him directly and confirmed that all of the adults accused were guilty, even those who claimed they were innocent. And she even brought back the names of Franck and Sandrine Lavier, who got to go home because their kids said that they never got assaulted by them. She said, bring them back, they're definitely guilty. She also told the judge about a sex shop where they would buy tapes from. So that's where they would get their porn tapes at home, but they would also sell the tapes they filmed at home of them sexually assaulted the kids. They would sell them back to that sex shop and they would distribute that footage to whoever was interested in that type of thing. And word got around, people would basically show up at the Delay apartment to participate in underage activities in exchange for money. So now they were basically talking about prostitution. She was basically implying that there was a huge prostitution ring organized by Thierry Delay, and he was basically pimping out his children to whoever showed up at his doorstep, and that's how they made money because they didn't work. So now the judge is officially fucked. He's no longer dealing with a fucked up family with shitty parents. He's dealing with a pedophile ring. So now this is incredibly serious. Of course, after that conversation with Miriam, he ships her back to prison, and now she gets very annoyed because she's like, whoa, you basically told me that I could go home. I gave you the information. Why am I still in prison? She's like, fine, I'll tell you more then, which is just so confusing. And now she gave more information saying that the pedophile ring is real and that a lot of it took place in Belgium on a farm. Now, while she's telling the judge all about this in her letters, one of the Delay boys implicated a few other adults. So he brought up Pierre Martel, who was the cab driver the family used to go get groceries at the store. He implicated their neighbor, who was an abbot or a priest, whatever the difference is, Dominique Viel. He lived next door as well. He allegedly came over to film them. The child implicated the Marico couple, who were notaries or bailiffs. Like, I'm not sure if it translates to bailiff or a notary, basically like high up people with like good paying jobs. So that's when it became very like, ooh, now the rich people are involved as well. This is a big ring. And he also implicated Danny Legrand, who lived in Belgium. Now, the other brothers confirmed what the brother had said, and the judge was shocked because the children actually brought up Belgium. They said Danny Legrand, who was from Belgium, when Miriam had just mentioned a farm in Belgium. So obviously the judge is like, well, fuck, like this is getting so much worse. Like, how could they both bring up Belgium without speaking to each other? This is very concerning. They had not been in contact at all. And the children were very precise in telling the judge what the adults had done to them, which again, no child should have access to that vocabulary or vision. So this, because they brought up Belgium and so did Myriam Badaoui, this became an international affair. This was no longer just in France. This implicated another country. So this added another level of just, what's the word I'm looking for? This was no longer just a case. This was an absolute monster of a case. Police, of course, started looking for a Danny Legrand in Belgium. They can't find anyone in Belgium by that name who would have anything to do with this case, but they did find a Daniel Legrand in France who had written a fake check in Belgium, and actually he happened to live very close to the Delay hometown, so they went to pick him up, but they also found out that his name was also Daniel Legrand, so they both had the same name, and police couldn't figure out which one would be the Daniel Legrand mentioned by the children, so they just brought both in for questioning. And the judge obviously went back to Miriam to confront her with the stories that her children were telling, the confessions that the children had made, and she confirmed what the children had said. In a letter she wrote to the judge, she said, "The more I tell you, the more you want me to say." And basically she was implying the fact that she now needed to lie to get his attention in order for her to finally get out of jail. She's basically saying, like, now you're asking me to imply people, like, you're asking me to name people who I don't know. You're asking me to give names of people I can't name because obviously they're not implicated. Which again, this is what she's saying in the letters. That doesn't mean that's what happened or what the judge implied ever. But it is important to note that this should have been a huge red flag. I'm not sure if the judge was aware of this. I'm sure he was, but obviously when you have someone writing letters like that saying, well, basically you're asking me to lie so that I can go free. You have to be very cautious with the stories she's telling, but at the same time, a lot of her stories are backed up by her own children, 4 of them, who again are separated and have no contact with her. So he still needs to look into this, obviously. But then obviously this took another turn because she accused, so Myriam Badaoui accused Daniel Legrand Sr., so the father, of owning a farm in Belgium, which is where he organized orgies with the children. Allegedly, Pierre Martel, the cab driver that one of the Delay children spoke of, was their regular cab driver. He would take the children to Belgium in his car. And Odile Marico was known as a baker. I'm not sure if she was a baker or if she ran like a corner store. She would take the children, she would basically hide all of the porn tapes under her supplies, like her food inventory in her car. Like all the tapes would be hidden below, and they would film stuff in Belgium and bring them back to sell them. Allegedly, they would organize all of this. Once they got to the farm, they would start preparing the children. And obviously this was not just the Delay children, this implicated many other children. And in order for the children to comply, Miriam said that she would often be attached to a wall or a bed and that she would be injured. So if the children didn't do whatever the adults said, she would get injured, and obviously not wanting to see her get injured, the children would comply. She also said that sometimes farm animals were involved. This was never confirmed, obviously, but she did bring that up. Police tried to locate the farm mentioned by Miriam and the children, and on November 9th, 2001, police took 2 of the Delay children to Belgium to try and figure out where that farm was. And they were in separate cars, by the way. They took each child in a separate car, and they both confirmed that it was in Gelved, a town in Belgium. And they pointed out the same farm, number 87. One of them wasn't sure if it was 81 or 87, but just to be very, very clear, both children were brought in separate cars to a completely different country, and they both pointed out the exact same farm. And police were like, right, okay, well then your kids showed this farm. They speak to Miriam, they're like, well, which one is it? Because one of them is saying 81, the other one's saying 87. She's like, well, actually it's both. Not sure how close they were together. However, she said it's actually both, which is why one of the kids was confused. Now, while they're looking into these farms, police arrested the Marico couple, Dominique Viel, the priest, and Pierre Martel, the cab driver. Dominique Viel was arrested very early one morning without obviously any warning whatsoever. I believe it was like 6 in the morning. Police banged on his door and cuffed him immediately, and when he asked them what they were looking for or what they were doing, they basically said, stop pretending you're innocent, we know you burned the evidence. So obviously he's kind of there like, well, if you think I've burned the evidence, then what are you looking for? Like, if I've burned it, then it's not there, so stop looking, I guess. He was very confused, like very, very confused as to why he was being arrested. He couldn't believe it, and to be honest, in his interview, he did say like it was so unbelievable that he wasn't too concerned, because he's like, right, this is a fluke, they're going to quickly realize that I've got nothing to do with this. So he actually wasn't too worried. You know, I guess it's one of those things, like if you know you've done nothing wrong, then you have nothing to worry about. That's how he felt. Police also arrested Daniel Legrand Jr. and Sr., even though the children had referred to both of them as Danny, and Daniel Legrand Sr. confirmed that he had never, ever, ever been nicknamed Danny in his entire life. Like Danny, basically. He had never been nicknamed that in his entire life. I'm not so sure about Daniel Legrand Jr., but the father was like, never in my life has anyone referred to me as Danny. By the end of November 2001, the judge, Fabrice Burgot, is convinced that he is now dealing with an international pedophile ring. And that's because the Delay children brought up that farm in Belgium, and that was confirmed by some of the adults interrogated. And this was obviously incredibly, incredibly serious, because a few years prior, Belgium dealt with the scandal of Marc Dutroux, which is a case I will cover at some point, not anytime soon. And it's basically a man who abducted, raped, and murdered little girls. And it's one of the biggest scandals, one of the biggest cases in Belgium. It was still very fresh. It completely changed the country as a whole. And obviously the judge was incredible. Police, everyone involved was very, very concerned that this had something to do with the Marc Dutroux affair. And it is important to point out that this affair in France, this case I'm talking about right now, is known as the Affaire d'Outreau, like the Outreau affair. And it sounds a lot like Dutroux, which is Marc Dutroux. So a lot of people confuse them, but they're very similar, and some of it happened in Belgium, so they're very, very concerned. When they searched the farms, the owner of both farms could not believe what police was looking for. They're like, excuse me, absolutely not. And police found nothing incriminating at the farms, so they tried to turn their attention to the sex shop mentioned by Myriam Badaoui. But they found nothing there either, so they didn't get any solid evidence anywhere. Police did notice that the most recently accused, so Dominique Viel, the Marico couple, Daniel Legrand Jr. and Sr. and Pierre Martel all seemed completely blindsided by this arrest. Like, they genuinely had no clue what they were doing, why they were being dragged into this awful story. And actually, when police interrogated Daniel Legrand Sr., he even had to ask police what a dildo was, because he had no idea. He'd never heard of that. That's basically, it was so not his world. And he was like, it was very awkward because police had to explain that to him, because he's like, I don't even know what that is. Yeah, they all seemed very blindsided. And it's important to know that by that time, 16 adults were held in jail, and all were accused of having sexually assaulted multiple children. The names were originally kept private, but the press quickly found out, and very shortly their entire reputations were destroyed. People found out about the names, and obviously people hate pedophiles, so once their name got out, even though they were so far only accused but not, there had been no trial, they hadn't been, innocent until proven guilty. That's not really a thing with the press, so the names got leaked, and from then on their reputations were irreparable. Their lawyers tried to get their names cleared. They basically tried to get them released because there was no physical evidence. The only reason they had all been arrested and their children had been taken away from them was because Myriam Badaoui, her children, and other children as well as other adults accused them all. But that was the extent of the evidence. It was just their word against what actually happened, I guess. Outreau quickly got the reputation of a dumpster town, obviously. A lot of the press and media took some of the stories and completely exaggerated them, blew them out of proportions. Some of the stories were straight up fake, which never helps in these very sensitive cases where a lot of the evidence is based on people's testimonies. So, the last thing you need is press making up stories. That's the last thing you need. But what's interesting is that Daniel Legrand Jr. confronted the three adults who named him, David Delplanque, Aurélie Grenon, and Myriam Badaoui, and he couldn't believe what was going on. He tried to have them, he wanted to confront them individually, because whenever they would reply, the other two would repeat. So if the judge asked a question to Myriam Badaoui, she would answer, and then the other two would say the same thing, and then the judge would kind of say, see, they're all agreeing. And he's like, well, obviously they're all agreeing because they're just repeating what the other person said. Let me speak to them one-on-one and you'll see their stories don't add up. But that was refused. He never got to confront them individually, which is not completely fair. I definitely will defend him there. I don't think it's right to have him confront three adults who accuse him of something. It's very hard to defend yourself when you're feeling attacked. He also said he couldn't understand why he was being implicated, because at the time he was 19. At the time of the interrogation, he was 20. And he said he was still a virgin, and that his entire life was football. That's all he cared about was football. So why is he being dragged into this awful case? But strangely enough, 2 days later, he confessed to all of the crimes he had been accused of. He told police he knew the couple because he would go to Outreau to buy his weed. He didn't live in that town, but he would go buy his weed in Outreau and would often end up at the Delay flat. And there, over time, he got offered money and weed in exchange for his participation. He claimed he made 300 to 600 francs back then. And then between the ages of 15 and 19, he would often be involved in orgies with men, women, children, etc. He did insist that his dad had nothing to do with any of this because his dad was too busy focusing on his job and their family. But he said he also stopped participating in that stuff when he was 19 because he got sick of it. So that was an interesting confession. And finally, in January 2002, after 2 months in prison, Daniel Legrand Jr. decided to write a letter to the judge, Fabrice Burgot, to tell him that in 1999, he witnessed Thierry Delay sexually assaulting a little girl before beating her to death. And Miriam went on to confirm this story, but what the judge didn't know is that Daniel Legrand Jr. had made it all up. That's where I'm going to leave this story for now. This video will end now, and I'm sorry for this cliffhanger. I will be back in a few days with the second part of this video. My camera is about to die. This was perfect timing. I will be back with the rest of this video, and I don't know what I'm saying anymore. My brain's fried. Let me know what you think about this case so far. There's so much more to talk about, so please keep your eyes peeled. In the next couple of days, I will post the second part, and I will see you then. Bye.